Welcome into a brand new episode of the Whole Story Podcast, where you get a new look into someone's career in a journey and also the story behind how they got to where they are today. On today's episode is Emmy Award-winning and Sports Broadcasting Hall of Famer Bob Costas. Bob, thank you again for joining the show today, and I know that you don't have a Twitter or any social media and never will. But Joe Buck and many other sportscasters are putting out videos of them getting their reps in, as of course there's no sports in this unprecedented time in the world's history. So have you been doing anything in particular to keep your reps going during this time?
Absolutely not. I'm watching some of the classic games that are on the NBA Network and the Major League Baseball Network. I'm following the news as best I can, trying to get some exercise in, trying to get some fresh air, going for walks with my wife, trying to get some reading done that I didn't have a chance to do when I was on the air more regularly. But when the time comes to go back to doing baseball or whatever, I'm sure it'll be like riding a bike. It'll be fine.
Do you think, I know there's a lot of questions out there whether or not we will see baseball this season. Any person that's a fan of baseball or sports as a whole listening to this podcast, do you have any inspiration to them to how can they get through this time, but also some hope into having some baseball this year?
Well, I don't think false hope does anybody any good. The best they can possibly hope for is somewhere between 81 and 100 games. But there's also a possibility, based on what experts tell us, not based on my feeling about anything, based on what experts tell us, it could begin to flatten in the summertime and then spike again. So it's possible that baseball could start and then not be able to finish once you get into September or October, which might be worse than never starting at all. And Dr. Fauci and other credible sources may be telling us, look, if this thing flattens so that for the sake of argument, it's 90 to 95% reduced, do you want to let that 5 to 10% be out there interacting, whatever that factor is, and perhaps contributing to a spike? So is it possible that there will be no baseball season at all? Yes, that's possible. Am I able to put a percentage on it? I don't have a crystal ball. I think the best they can do is hope for something close to half a season. And among the many possibilities is that there's no season.
Mm-hmm. Let's switch gears, get into your career. I want to mention your first gig in this industry. And when you hear the team name, the Spirits of St. Louis, what first comes to your mind?
Zaniness, but a whole lot of great memories. Missouri football and basketball of the St. Louis Blues, of the football Cardinals before they moved to Arizona. Jack Buck, Joe Garagiola, Harry Carey, Gary Bender, later a young Joe Buck, Dan Deerdorf, and many others had all worked there. Their staff was almost good enough to staff an entire network sports division. And here I was, a 22-year-old kid, stepping into that environment. So that was a pretty heady situation for a young guy.
Of course, this industry is competitive, and there's a lot of jealousy that's built into this. Did you have to, at any point when you first got this gig, again, at a young age, and I'm sure people always say I would cut off my arm to have a gig like that, did you have to deal with the jealousness or competitiveness of that career at that age?
I imagine there may have been some people, I don't think actually my contemporaries so much, but there might have been some older and more established broadcasters who were resentful that I had not paid my dues as they may have. But if they knew me personally, they would have known that I was more than prepared to pay my dues. I actually was doing minor league hockey the year before I got the Spirits job for $30 a game and $5 a day meal money on the road while still a senior at Syracuse University. Would I have gone to the minor leagues to do baseball? Absolutely, I would have. Would I have gone to a smaller market and a less prestigious station than St. Louis's KMOX? Of course I would have. As it happened, it didn't break that way. And nobody in my position would have turned it down. Nobody would have said, oh, you know what? It's not fair. I'll wait another 5 years. I went to prove myself. And if I couldn't have done the job at least adequately, I would have been out of the job. So could there have been people who resented me? Yeah, I'm sure there were people who resented Joe Buck when he broke through early and others. But if you can do the job, then that takes care of everything else.
Bob, we had Ken Rosenthal on this podcast last week, and I asked him this same question, if he ever felt challenged in college, and I'll ask you that same question.
Challenged in college? In what way?
Sports broadcasting is a knack, and in some ways, you can't really teach it. And
Yes.
of course, when you're doing this, it takes a special talent to do it at a high level. Did you feel like, again, no disrespect to any college that is teaching sports broadcasting, but it takes a special talent to do it at such a high level, like what Ken is doing in his way and what you have done throughout your entire career?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Alex. And when I first heard tapes of myself, when I was 18 years old as a freshman at Syracuse University, where the Newhouse School of Public Communications, both print journalism and broadcast journalism, is perhaps the most prestigious in the country even then, and that reputation has only grown. So I was in the right place, that's for sure. But when I first heard tapes of myself, I was very disappointed. I'm thinking, my gosh, my voice isn't so great. I still have a few remnants of a Long Island accent, sounding like a New Yorker. I knew that Al Michaels was only in his 20s at that time, late 20s, I guess, and was doing the World Series because he was the voice of the Cincinnati Reds. Between 18 and 25, that's going to be a different professional growth spurt than between 38 and 45. I didn't realize that at the time, but that eventually sunk in. And you're right when you say that broadcasting is a knack. You want to get as good an education as you possibly can, a well-rounded education. And you can certainly learn things about the craft and about the proper approach. But you could be the most dedicated person, the most hardworking person, a very intelligent person, and want to be a broadcaster and just not really have the knack. So, you got to start out with a knack, but then you've got to put in the time and the attention to develop that knack. And I think that's what every good broadcaster wound up doing.
When you're in an interview and you have to break away and you have to, again, I know we talked about this the last time I interviewed you, it's all about listening to the person that you're interviewing. And I know how much you love the long form interview style and the technique that it is. And of course, I can sit here and list off the names that you've interviewed, but how do you differentiate a time when you have to decide, am I going to follow up with that person, what they just said, or am I going to go on and ask the next question? How can you know when to push the gas pedal on a follow-up question without hurting their feelings? And when you are talking about real-world news in sports, there is sometimes that crossover with real-world news and sports news. So how can you know when to ask that follow-up question to a response?
I don't think there's any definite set of rules for that. It's a feel for it. Is a follow-up necessary? Is what I might get out of a follow-up worth it? Or have we pretty much covered this topic and this line of questioning? Also, even if it's a relatively long interview, sometimes you have time constraints. In the back of your head, you're saying, well, I've got 3 minutes left here. How do I want to use those 3 minutes? It's just a feel. And after you've done it for a while, you should have a better sense of that than when you began.
When you interviewed Vince McMahon about the first colossal fail of the XFL, and I'll ask you after this response about the XFL 2.0, and when you and Vince kind of went, well, he got combative about, because again, to this point in time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong with this statement, but any other interview that Vince or Mr. McMahon did up to this point was a part of a storyline. And this was his first real interview where you asked him about topics that a lot of professional wrestling fan, but also non-professional wrestling fan wanted to know, because he is now dipping into professional football and a real sport. And when he got combative, and you once said that, well, the only other option I had was to lean forward when he first started getting more of in your face and pointed the finger at you. What was going through your mind during that time of saying, okay, well, yeah, I know you had your producer in your ear yelling at you, well, keep going, but also knowing that you got something good right here working between you two?
No, I knew it was good television. It was live. It's HBO, so there are no commercials.
Mm-hmm.
It went on for nearly a half an hour, and much of that was unremitting tension. So I know it's good TV, but I'm trying to stay with a line of questioning that has journalistic merit. I wasn't trying to stir it up beyond what it already was. I didn't expect him to react that way, but when he did, the idea is to keep your composure, keep your wits about you. And I didn't think, as some people did, that I was in any kind of real physical peril, but I knew he was trying to intimidate me, both with body language and with the words that were coming back at me. And then when he came forward in his seat and began jabbing a finger toward me, I actually came forward closer to him and smiled at him a little bit. And I think that set him off all the more. You're right, though, when you say that prior to that time, I don't know if he'd never been interviewed in a serious way. He probably had, but 99% of the interviews he had done were staged in what was then the WWF, now the WWE. And I wasn't the only one who received that treatment. Armin Katayan, a very, very good sports reporter who's worked at CBS and at HBO and does 60 Minutes quality stuff, he was interviewing McMahon some years ago and asking him similarly challenging questions. And Vince got mad and slapped Armin's notes out of his hand. So this is not unprecedented for Vince McMahon. And I guess there are some people who are hardcore wrestling fans or whatever who think that the winner of an exchange, if there has to be a winner, there doesn't always have to be, but if it becomes confrontational like that, people are going to see it in those terms. The winner is whoever yelled the loudest or whoever seemed as if they could win a back alley fight. Oh, sure, Vince McMahon could have crushed me like a grape if he wanted to. But by that line of reasoning, as he himself has said subsequently, it would have been interesting if Bob was closer to my size. But let's take that logic or illogic and push it forward. I don't know what Chuck Todd's weight is, but let's say Chuck Todd weighs 175 pounds as the host of Meet the Press. And some senator from Illinois also weighs 175 pounds. And he doesn't like the line of questioning. As long as they're in the same weight division, why don't they just duke it out? You see how preposterous his position is. This is a conversation. And if the merits of the questions and the answers are to be determined by who could win an arm wrestling match or some sort of back alley fight, then eventually Vince McMahon or anybody else would run up against somebody bigger and stronger than they were. And would that decide the merits of the points they're trying to make? I'm very content with what happened on that night in 2001. And I hope so he can sleep well. I hope that Vince is too.
It should be noted, and again, you used to be a professional wrestling fan, but not before this Attitude Era and what it is now known as professional wrestling became what everyone knows it as to be.
Yeah, I grew up as a wrestling fan, and that goes back to the early 1960s, watching wrestling on black and white TV, and it was a broad farce, good-natured, cartoonish-type characters, and then we know what it became. And the women became not damsels in distress, but objectified in a way that only the most desensitized dope would find appealing. And then there were other aspects of it, and obviously it was saturated with steroids and least common denominator vulgarity. Look, let's make this clear. I'm no prude about this stuff. I grew up with Saturday Night Live. I can give you every Richard Pryor, Chris Rock, George Carlin routine you can think of. But there's a difference between pushing the boundaries with wit and intelligence and actually something to say, and just, in effect, banging two garbage can lids together and calling it entertainment.
XFL 2.0, success or failure?
I think it was headed toward being a success on its own terms. They presented it as football. It looked like real football with some interesting changes in the rules. And if they had kept it that way, where it could have been a minor league, but an entertaining minor league that would have given NFL guys, either ex-players or those who didn't make the cut, a chance, could have been a feeder system to the NFL, could have fed what for some people is an obsession with football, and they have to have it, 365 days a year or close to it. I think it was headed toward being successful, especially in towns that didn't have 3 or 4 top-tier professional leagues, including the NFL. St. Louis, for example, was doing very well, having lost the Rams and with little prospect of getting another NFL team. That seemed like a good XFL market. And they had kept all the lowbrow stuff that made the first iteration of the XFL such a colossal failure. They kept all that out. So I think they were on their way to doing it right. And then, like so many other things, it's short-circuited by the larger concern about the coronavirus pandemic. And we'll see when the world returns to normal, whenever that is, whether they can start it back up.
Bob, when was the last time you were shocked?
By what?
By anything in the sports world, or, when you get to the point in your career, I know I've interviewed Bob Ryan about this before, where the word shocked is so over the top and overly repeated, and a word that's frankly overused by many. Same with breaking news, and you can go on a long list of just simply overused terms.
How about this? Every night you're watching SportsCenter, someone tells you that something is unbelievable. You'll hear someone say, he has gone since the All-Star break. He's done an unbelievable job. He's gone 8-2 with an ERA of 2.75. Right. No, that's an excellent job. Is that unbelievable? Has it never happened before? Are people awestruck by that? Another one is such and such a team. You hear this more in the NFL than anywhere else. Late in the season, they control their own fate, or they control their own destiny. Well, if it's fate or destiny, how could you possibly control it? Or this puts it all in perspective. And yet we have to hear that every single time something more important than sports intrudes upon sports. Supposedly that puts it all in perspective. But if that was ever true, wouldn't that perspective have lasted? Must have a very short shelf life. The whole thing's going to come up again. So, imprecise language abounds, I guess, in the culture overall, and it affects sports as well.
Do you feel like, though, and you talk about the moments where, like you said, every night if you're watching SportsCenter, it's unbelievable. When was the last moment in sports that truly you had a loss for words?
I hope I wasn't at a loss for words, because it's a broadcaster's job to find the right words in those moments. And maybe this isn't the most recent one, but it's just one that pops into my mind as you pose the question. The first time Usain Bolt won the 100 meters at the Olympics, which would be Beijing in 2008, as you know, that is an event that is won almost always by milliseconds. And I think Tom Hammond's call, and by the way, Tom Hammond, as a track and field announcer, is one of the most underrated broadcasters of my lifetime. His calls in real time, even if it's tape delayed, played back into the States in some situations, he's calling it in real time. Those are so difficult to call. And he pulls it off with excitement, with insight, and without a single bobble. Fantastic. And what he said when Usain Bolt pulled away, Usain Bolt winning by distance. You never hear that in the 100 meters. There was a huge gap between him and I forget who was second. Huge gap. The guy who was second was closer to fifth or sixth than he was to Usain Bolt. That bordered on shocking. It was certainly impressive.
When you said having the right words, the first thing that popped into my mind, and I know you've been asked this countless of times, and I won't ask you what your favorite moment was in your career, and I know you've said it's like a tie for 20, but 1996, the Olympics, opening ceremony, Muhammad Ali. Take me through that moment.
Well, almost no one knew who the final torchbearer would be. It was a closely guarded secret, and Dick Ebersol, who ran NBC Sports then, was the guy who had the idea. And he sold it to Billy Payne, the head of the Atlanta Olympic Organizing Committee. And in the days prior to the opening ceremony, he told me and Dick Enberg, we were the co-hosts, he said, I'm not going to tell you who it is. You'll know who he or she is the minute you see that person. But I want your reaction to be as spontaneous as the people in the stadium and the people watching on television. And I'm told that they rehearsed it only one time at about 3 o'clock in the morning. So almost no one knew. And the way they staged it was perfect because Muhammad literally stepped out of shadows and into the bright spotlight in front of the cauldron. Janet Evans, the great Olympic swimmer, was the second to last torchbearer. She climbed the steep steps, got to the top, and then Muhammad emerged. And it was so striking to see him in his compromised condition, and yet, hey, it's Muhammad Ali, visibly trembling from the effects of the Parkinson's syndrome, but able to light the cauldron. And now, some 24 years later, I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'd be very surprised if there was a single person in that stadium in Atlanta that night who didn't have goosebumps themselves.
You mentioned Atlanta. How difficult was that location for that ceremony, especially with all the outside news surrounding that ceremony as a whole?
Well, there had been a crash of an airliner leaving New York over the Atlantic Ocean only days before the opening ceremony. It later turned out that it was determined that it was not a terrorist act, but at the time it was widely assumed that it was. And that caused concern about the security surrounding the Olympics. So we were on alert to a certain extent. Centennial Park in Atlanta was designed as a non-high security zone. People didn't have to go through magnetometers like they would almost anywhere else. There was security there, yes, but it wasn't as completely locked down as other Olympic venues and the hotels and everything else, because they wanted people to freely associate with one another. They wanted it to be an open atmosphere, and of course that set the stage for the bombing, which disrupted the Olympics and our coverage of the Olympics. And that's an example of how, no matter how well you prepare for what you think the specifics will be, you have to be ready to pivot. Luckily, we had Tom Brokaw there and a battalion of people from NBC News, so they were able to take up some of the slack. But Hannah Storm did a very good job. Jim Lampley did a very good job. I think of Al Michaels when the earthquake hit in 1989. He's there to call the World Series. And yet he shifted into newsman mode and was invaluable, along with Peter Jennings, who was a continent away in New York for ABC News. Al was invaluable providing information. Good broadcasters should be able to address topics in real time beyond all one strike two. Al did it that night, and I hope that some of us did it in Atlanta in 1996.
And that's what's so interesting about your particular career, because you don't just do play-by-play. You don't just do interviews. You don't just host a talk show. You kind of are able to do all of that, and I feel like the best way to kind of put it all into one piece is, or I should say, are the opening ceremony for the Olympics. How difficult was that for you to make sure that you are also finding the humor in it, but also giving the justice to each country?
I will tell you this. The opening ceremony of the Olympics has always been a head-scratcher for me. It's a thankless task, especially as you move into the modern era with the internet and social media and whatnot, and people can pick at every little thing. There are some people who believe that the opening ceremony, especially the Parade of Nations, should be treated as if it's high church. There are other people who view it as some sort of combination between a United Nations Security Council meeting and Cirque du Soleil. Yes, there's a lot of stuff there that's inspiring and that actually calls for a bit of respect and maybe even reverence. But then some of us feel that some of that can be leavened by a little bit of lighthearted humor, some tongue-in-cheek stuff. There are absurdities. It kind of goes back and forth. NBC's approach was that you had to have some tidbit of information at least about every nation. And if you're talking about the Summer Olympics, that's more than 200 nations. When I co-hosted it with Katie Couric, we referred to it as tidbit ping pong. Okay, you take Latvia, I'll take Lithuania. Some nations have a small delegation and it's one quick observation. Others, much larger delegations and more significant in a variety of ways, And so you bring more information to bear. But I don't know that there's a correct way to do it, because there are so many different expectations on the part of the audience for something like this. I don't think you can ever really ace that if acing it means that everybody was happy with the way you did it. I began to have misgivings about it. I hosted 11 Olympics in prime time. After about the fifth or sixth one, I was thinking to myself, really, I want to start on day 2 when the competition starts and have somebody else host the opening ceremony. But then I thought, look, it's my job. I'm the primetime host. It's my responsibility. And if it's a minefield, I'm the guy that has to try and tiptoe through that minefield. I shouldn't pass that responsibility off. And so I did it all the way through, except for the last 2, except for the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014 and the Summer Olympics, the last one I did in Rio in 2016. And by that time, I was ready to wave the white flag. I was ready to say to whomever, hey, if you can figure out how to do this, good luck.
Baseball play-by-play and long-form interviews was your response to what's next for you. Does that still hold up today?
Yes. Yeah.
And
when baseball resumes, that's what I'll be doing for the Major League Baseball Network. And then some form of journalism, commentary, long-form interviews, that sort of thing. When the world gets back to normal, then I'll find myself doing that.
So when you were with NBC, again, baseball has not been on NBC since 2000. And frankly, you pitched the idea to interview Roger Goodell, and NBC asked the NFL, but it seemed like no network wants to kind of push back on the NFL. It seems like it's the other way around with that. What went through your mind into knowing, like you said, waving the white flag, not only just with the Olympics, but knowing that you had some pushback on the idea of still doing football? You just didn't feel like you wanted to do it. It wasn't what you wanted to do at this moment in time in your career. You wanted to do baseball. You wanted to do long-form, journalistic style interviews. When did you know that, and what challenge went through your mind into giving that white flag?
Well, I knew it in the early 2000s, but I had HBO to scratch some of those itches. And then I had to make a very difficult decision when the Baseball Network came into existence in 2009. They came to me almost immediately. I didn't inquire of them. They came to me and said that they'd like to have me join the network. And I wanted to do that, but maintain my position at HBO. And HBO's position was, we'll sign you to a new contract right now, but you can't do both. That will dilute our exclusivity for you in cable. We understand that you're at NBC, but on cable, the world has changed since then. But in 2009, their position was, you got to choose. And it was a very difficult choice, but I went with the baseball. And there went the place to do commentary, long-form interviews, some kind of journalism. That went away. And without baseball and without the NBA, the two things I enjoyed most outside of the Olympics at NBC, I became kind of a square peg in a round hole. I enjoyed hosting the Kentucky Derby and the other Triple Crown horse races. I certainly had great respect for what the Olympics represent and great appreciation for what all my colleagues did. They often made me look better. I hope occasionally I made them look better. I had great respect for it, but after a while, I just felt like this was not as close to the bullseye for me as the first 20 or 25 years of my career had been. So maybe I stayed a little bit too long at the dance. A lot of that was out of loyalty to NBC and appreciation for the friendships and the relationships over the years. But I could see the end of the tunnel as we got to the teens, the 2010s. And to your question about Goodell, here's how I felt at the end. I could do some of the boilerplate things, the hosting things that NBC or some other network might have wanted someone like me to do. But I looked around, especially when it came to football, and I said, look, the highlights are covered. The speculation about this draft choice, this trade, this change in a head coaching spot, you've got a zillion people doing that. What can I do that would be a different and perhaps close to unique contribution. It's the journalistic part. I didn't want the journalistic part to intrude upon the games themselves or the action of those games, but when it was appropriate, and certainly it would have been appropriate during the Super Bowl broadcast in 2018, you got a 6-hour pregame show. What I can contribute to that is let me do a legitimate interview of some length with Roger Goodell. Mm-hmm. It's been a very newsworthy year in the NFL, and people's interest in the NFL transcends the sports pages. So many different issues that people would want to hear about. So not only would it be journalistically responsible, it would be good television. And I'm sure that they asked, and I'm just as sure that it was rejected out of hand immediately, and I'm just as sure that they didn't push beyond that. And at that point, I say to myself, is there really anything special that I can contribute here anymore? I'm able to do it, but are they going to give me a place to do it? Apparently not. Okay. It's been a long and wonderful and productive run, and I look back on it with appreciation, but all good things must end.
One of, talking about special factors that you brought, in my opinion, was the essays, not during the live play of the game, either during the pregame or halftime. And you look back at the controversial side of things, and again, I know you've said before where if it's a news story about giving milk to an orphan, as it goes through 10 times, it turns into a bad news story. And, like you said also, everyone is entitled to his or her own opinion, but simply the facts are there. How much did you enjoy those long-form essays that you used to do throughout the time at NBC?
I enjoyed them very much, and I think the majority of them were well done. I hope they were well written and delivered, but a lot of credit goes to the people back in New York. I would be at the site of whatever the game was, and very often they weren't done in terms of the writing till, 7-8 minutes to go in the second quarter. And these people put together B-roll, because most of the time I wasn't on camera. Let's say it was 2 minutes. I'd say 1 minute and 30 seconds of the average one had some kind of B-roll that complemented the script, and they did an excellent job of making it a good 2-minute television production. I don't think that every single week measured up to my highest standard, because the idea was you got to do one every week, and sometimes there's a fertile subject and sometimes there isn't. But the best of them I thought were very good. And to your point, when people say interrupting the game, I don't know what they're thinking of or what they're looking at. The number of times I have ever done something like that overlapping the action is exactly zero. Exactly zero. The Olympics, NBA, baseball, football, exactly zero. So I was quoting the late, great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who memorably said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts.
When do you know, and again, almost simply differentiating, when to put in those drops of real news in sports?
It's a feel. It's a feel. Is it important enough? Is it pertinent enough? Is it current enough? Is this the appropriate time to do it?
Do you feel like that people now are doing that up to the standard, in your opinion? I know last time I asked what your biggest pet peeve was, and it was simply truth in mainstream media and in the news. Do you feel like, and I'm not too sure of, you still have the same concept of the essays in sports today, but do you feel like that still is implicated, successfully done, in your opinion?
Sometimes. I think Scott Van Pelt does a wonderful job on a nightly basis on ESPN. It's a different kind of thing, but his broadcasts have a texture to them. Some lighthearted stuff, some meat and potatoes news, but some essays and some historical stuff, some pointed commentary. Very good. Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel, Outside the Lines on ESPN, various podcasts. Sure, there's a lot of good stuff out there, but most of what's out there is fervent debate about who's under more pressure, Dak Prescott or Aaron Rodgers, and it's May 10th. I don't know. That's your cup of tea, go ahead. I don't think that has much lasting merit to it, but there's still some good work being done. Is it as large a percentage of the overall as perhaps it should be? Probably not.
Last question for you. How important is baseball in today's world, and especially with the future of sports in this country?
Well, I think when sports in general returns, but perhaps baseball in particular, it will be deeply appreciated. Baseball is a companion, in a sense, because it's day in, day out, night in, night out. Even if you're not intensely following or intently following the specific game, you know it's there, and you follow the course of a season, that sort of thing. So when that returns, it'll be one of the many indications that the country and the world is getting back to normal.
Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining this podcast today. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks very much.